In the 10 years that the How to Train Your Dragon franchise has existed, the creators of the franchise have came up with many different dragon designs for its many different species found within the world of How to Train Your Dragon. Likewise, Skylanders also has a lot of dragons to offer, with the first game having one dragon per element for Pete's sake. So in other words, there are definitely some similarities between those dragons and Skylanders and the dragon species within the How to Train Your Dragon franchise. So that's what we're going to be counting down today. The top 10 most similar Skylanders and How to Train Your Dragon dragons. Now, we are going to be looking at dragons specifically, but to classify a Skylander as a dragon, they don't need to have wings necessarily. So we're going to be looking at similarities in terms of colours, aesthetics, and even abilities in certain cases. So without further ado, we're going to get into this top 10 countdown. Starting us off, we have Spotlight, who I would regard as quite similar to the Light Fury in terms of the aesthetics on display. Both of them are incredibly white, mind you, and when it comes down to, of course, the gender of the dragons as well, both are considered female, at least for Light Fury and How to Train Your Dragon for Hidden World specifically most certainly is. Now, both of them are also quite graceful in their movement and have light-based abilities, but really that's where the similarities end. These rings found within the wings and the tails, of course, don't reflect the Light Fury whatsoever, and they don't have some sort of giant symbol on their head, and they also have pupils, mind you. So since this combination is pretty far-fetched when it comes to the similarities, and the dragons definitely have their own respective differences, that's why it's as low as number 10 on the list, mind you. Next up, we have Echo, who I would regard as pretty similar to the Sea Shocker based on her aesthetics. If we zoom in on the figurine, we can notice the minor little details such as the scales that go along her back and the little bumps from all of the seawater that would surround her whilst being, well, in the sea. And that's one major similarity right out of the bat. Both of these are aquatic-based creatures. But on top of that, as you can see with the Sea Shocker, its scales and its overall aesthetic in terms of the design work and how it looks is pretty similar to Echo. Apart from one thing, it does feature wings and has two heads rather than one. But really, that's where the similarities begin and end of that, and also the fact that the Sea Shocker gets its name from its electric-based abilities, and Echo has none of those. So if Echo was a bit more of a mix of Echo and Punk Shock, then she'd be far more similar to the Sea Shocker. But as it stands, these beat out Spotlight and Light Fury just because they look more similar on an aesthetic and design-based level, and of course they are both aquatic-based. But that's where the similarities end, hence why we have Echo and the Sea Shocker at number 9 on the list right here. The most famous deadly Nadder in the How to Train Your Dragon franchise is the blue design known as Stormfly, which is Astra's dragon, but what people often forget is that the deadly Nadder is one of the most frequent dragons in the franchise, meaning that it has several different colour iterations, including a purple one, which is very similar to Flashwing right here. Now, the wings are completely different in design, since the wings for the deadly Nadder don't consist of crystals, and neither does the rest of its body, mind you, but when it comes down to the abilities of these dragons, they are incredibly similar in the fact that both of them shoot very sharp shards from their bodies with pinpoint accuracy at great speeds and distances and everything. So ultimately the abilities here are so similar that it grants Flashwing and the Deadly Nadder as low as number 8 on the list. And plus you can also get a green iteration of the Deadly Nadder that looks very similar in terms of its colour palette to Jade Flashwing. So I suppose if you recolour the Deadly Nadders, they also have similar based colour palettes to Flashwing at the very least. It's just that these dragons are aesthetically different is all. Next up is Camo and the Terrible Terror. Now, the Terrible Terrors are most commonly green in the series, so of course they have that colour similarity going for them right off the bat. But second of all, the main reason why I think these dragons are so similar is because their fire-based abilities look pretty similar, like Camo's Sunblasts look very similar in shape and design to the Fire Breath of the Terrible Terrors, so they have similar abilities. Then not to mention the horns for Camo look very, very similar, and as do the little scales that run down the back right here. They highly reflect that of a Terrible Terror, making them very similar on an aesthetic level, with the exception of the wings, because Camo doesn't have any of those, unlike the Terrible Terror. But even when it comes down to the tail, with Camo's being quite bushy, the Terrible Terrors even have a similar aesthetic to even that. And on all fours, when you don't see a Terrible Terror flying in there on all fours, they look similar to Camo as well, with their feet being a slightly different colour to the rest of their body, just like Camo right here. So ultimately, these two are far more similar than the dragons preceding them, even though Camo is lacking in the wing department. Next up on the list, we have Drobot and the Armor Wing. Now, what's really cool about both of these dragons is that neither of them have scales, so the armors melded to their body are the only form of armor that they can take. Both of these armors even consist of metals. And I'm sure Drobot must have used some sort of fire or laser on equipment to, of course, mold the armor to his body and his body shape. A bit like how the Armor Wing even utilizes his flame breath to mold his armor. So the fact that both of these dragons create armors made of metal in order to protect their very vulnerable, scaleless bodies is similar in concept and in execution, mind you. But ultimately, the main differences here is that Drobot is intelligent and can speak and is very, very robotic-like, unlike Armor Wing, which is very much a traditional dragon in How to Train Your Dragons, which means it's incapable of speech, mind you, and it utilizes a flame breath rather than eye lasers. Therefore, there are definitely differences in terms of their personalities and their abilities, but with the aesthetics and concept being so similar, I can't help but put Drobot and the Armor Wing any other spot than number 6 on the list right here. Next up, we have the Night Fury and Dark Spyro. Although the one and only Night Fury in How to Train Your Dragon is toothless, that's why you have the picture of the best fictional character to the left. Sorry about that, Spyro. But as I digress, these two dragons are very similar in terms of their colour palette, because Dark Spyro is black, just like Toothless is, and then he also has the horns just in front of his eyes and his snout to create a very characterizing base design, just like how Toothless has it. Sure, whilst his horns are a different colour to the rest of the scales on his body, his horns still look similar to Toothless's ears, which is what matters most. Now, both of these dragons are very iconic from their respective franchises, making them similar in and of itself. And ultimately, Dark Spyro, when it comes down to, of course, all of the little scales run down the back of his body here and the spikes, they're also very, very similar to Toothless himself. And the wings are a similar shape and design as well. So ultimately, if they just look aesthetically very, very similar, and this guy breathes purple fire a bit like the plasma blasts that Toothless possesses. Of course, there is definitely a big difference in speed. Since Spyro isn't the quickest dragon, that would probably go down to high 5, if you even classify him as a dragon from Skylanders, as serious that is. But as I digress, he's also not as accurate as Toothless. Therefore, when it comes to the real abilities of these dragons, besides having similar coloured blasts, their abilities are highly different from one another. And it makes both these dragons unique in their own respective franchises, allowing them to be as low as number 5, mind you. Number 4 is Cinder and the Skrill. Now, both these dragons are very similar on aesthetic-based level, since both of them are purple-based with lightning bolt type aesthetics, and even the scale designs are very, very similar as well. And not to mention, they're both pretty big dragons as well. Cinder tips on the slightly bigger side of the dragons when it comes down to the size of her wings and her body shape, mind you. And their abilities is easily the most similar of the list so far, since both of them breathe lightning rather than fire. Both of them summon lightning, a bit like Cinder's curse from the WoW Path Series 2 iteration. So overall, these two are just so damn similar in terms of a colour and design standpoint as well as an ability standpoint. And not to mention, both of these dragons were under the influence of evil beings at some point. Cinder from the Legend of Spyro series being under the control of Malifaux and being forced to do evil things against her will, and the Skrill being under Dagger's control in the How to Train Your Dragon franchise. So even their backgrounds and traumatic pasts are similar in a way, therefore that makes these two definitely quite similar in concept and in design, making them an easy number 4 spot on the list. Number 3 is Blades and the Razor Whip. Now, both of these dragons have chunky armors on their backs, which are incredibly sharp and utilized to cut through things very, very effectively. The tails in particular are both very, very sharp, accurate tools for cutting things very, very effectively. And not to mention, even for terms of how the armor looks and how it's scaled up, look at the detail on Blades' tail right here. They kind of pack into each other a bit similar to how the Razor Whip is. And not to mention, their bodies are very thin in comparison to their very long tails and wide wings. So their body shapes and design are very, very similar. So above all, when it comes to the aesthetics and abilities of these dragons, there are only 2 dragons in the 2 franchises that are more similar than these, starting with Bash and the Gronagles. Now, Bash has a rock armor around the rest of his body. That's ultimately what his scales consist of. And that creates a rather rough and bumpy texture, very similar to the Gronagle. And the two have very, very similar tails and body size, with them being quite big and thick, should we say, in terms of their body shape, and both of their tails having a wrecking ball based aesthetic. And both of them can use these to a necessary offense, in the fact that they can swing their tails quite hard at threats to effectively deal with them very, very well. Not to mention their teeth layout are very, very similar, with both of them having very, very sharp teeth. And above all, the Gronagle flies very infrequently, and the wings are so small, it's barely even an element of the design that you can count as different to Bash, because whilst Bash doesn't have wings, as I said before, the wings on the Gronagle are so small and insignificant to the rest of the design that ultimately that design difference goes unnoticed. And even the way that they walk on all fours is very, very similar, and the Gronagles can even roll themselves a bit similar to Bash. Not very well, mind you, but they certainly can do it, not as well as the other border-class dragons like the Catastrophic Quakin, which is similar to Bash as well, in terms of the fact that they have a kind of a rock-based aesthetic and roll just like him. But once again, those are very different in terms of their appearance when it comes to both their colorization and their body size. So ultimately, I did choose to put the Gronagle as a much more similar dragon to Bash, purely because the two look a whole lot more similar in terms of their scales, their rock-based armor, and of course the tail, most importantly of all. But hey, maybe brown isn't your color. Well, there are blue Gronagles, just like there are blue Bashes. So yes, that definitely does help with the aesthetics of the Gronagle, knowing that the different colors that they are in How to Train Your Dragon is represented in Skylanders as well, with there being different colours of Bash. But ultimately, the most similar How to Train Your Dragon species, and Skylander Dragon has to be Sunburn and the Monstrous Nightmare, purely because they look so similar on an aesthetic standpoint. The wings are very, very similar. The long tails are very, very similar, especially when it comes to the details of how these are coloured, with the red and yellow aesthetic, and the claws being extremely sharp as well. The wings aren't as sharp as the Monstrous Nightmare, but ultimately that's where the similarities end, because even their flame breaths are very, very similar, being much more of a traditional based flame breath than other dragons in the dragon species, and the same with Sunburn and the Skylanders franchise. And then there's also the fact that both of these characters set themselves on fire, which is an extremely cool aesthetic. that both of them share, making them easily the most similar in the whole between the whole of the two franchises, mind you. But that basically does it for this top 10 video. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll be seeing you for the next one. When that moment arises. Peace.